Well, welcome everyone to this webinar address by Professor Jeff Sachs, hosted by Monash University and by our Vice-Chancellor, Margaret Gardner. Joining us today, we have Monash alumni, supporters, friends, staff and students. I'm John Thwaites and I'm the chair of the Monash Sustainable Development Institute, and I'll be facilitating this event today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the various lands where we're meeting on, and to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We're very excited to have the opportunity to hear from Professor Jeff Sachs today, and many of us remember his outstanding Richard Larkins oration in 2018. Professor Sachs will address us, and after that there'll be an opportunity for questions. And I urge people that have questions to put them in the Q&A part of the screen, and we'll be curating those questions and get to as many as we can. But first, I'd like to now pass over to our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Margaret Gardner, who will introduce Professor Jeff Sachs. Vice-Chancellor.
Thank you, Professor Thwaites. It's wonderful, as always, to have you with us participating in this way. And we're particularly fortunate to have Professor Jeffrey Sachs with us for this special webinar event. And it indeed gives me very great pleasure to introduce him to you today. And it's so wonderful, even if in a virtual format, to have so many of our alumni with us. So Professor Sachs is University Professor and Director of the Centre for Sustainable Development at Columbia University in New York, where he directed the Earth Institute from 2002 until 2016. He's also Director of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and Monash is very pleased to be the regional centre for that network in Australia, New Zealand and the Pacific. Professor Sachs has had a very distinguished career and continues to have a distinguished career. He's been advisor to 3 United Nations Secretaries General and currently serves as a Sustainable Development Goal Advocate under Secretary General Antonio Guterres. He spent more than 20 years as a professor at Harvard University before he went to Columbia, and it was at Harvard where he received his education, his BA, MA and PhD. He's also authored numerous bestseller books, his most recent being The Ages of Globalization, Geography, Technology and Institutions, which was published this year. Professor Sachs was twice named as one of Time magazine's 100 most influential world leaders and was ranked by The Economist among the top 3 most influential living economists. Most recently, he was named chair of the Lancet COVID-19 Commission, to which our own Professor Thwaites has also been appointed. The Lancet COVID-19 Commission has been created to help speed up global, equitable and lasting solutions to this pandemic. I was delighted to host a webinar with Professor Sachs as guest speaker for Monash Business School's Centre for Development, Economics and Sustainability just a couple of months ago. And as some of you may know, Professor Sachs sits on the advisory board of the Monash Sustainable Development Institute, where Professor Thwaites is the chair. And many of you will recall that in 2018, as Professor Thwaites mentioned, Professor Sachs was conferred an honorary doctorate and also delivered the university's prestigious Richard Larkins oration. It was a wonderful oration and still much commented on by those who were in the audience. Today's webinar can be viewed as a follow-up discussion to that event. We're pleased, as always, to welcome Professor Sachs once again to Monash, and we all look forward to his thoughts on the COVID-19 roadmap to recovery, where he has a particular emphasis on the importance of the Sustainable Development Goals, fair climate objectives, and global cooperation. I think it's important that when we're in crisis, we keep firmly focused on the long-term strategic goals to which we should be committed and the values and principles to which we should continue to adhere. Here at Monash, we remain committed to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and we recognise that globally We face enormous social, economic and environmental challenges, not only those we are currently facing through this global pandemic. Today, about 3,000 of Monash researchers are contributing to advancing the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and in addition to world-leading research, we're also committed to teaching today's students, who are tomorrow's activists and decision makers, to think critically and ethically, to cope with ethical dilemmas, and to apply the broad thinking approaches that are necessary to dealing with serious and complex societal problems. This commitment through Monash, not only enacted through research and education, but recognising that we have to lead by example. And indeed, Monash has committed itself as an organisation to net zero, and that net zero by 2030 goal is an act of our commitment to sustainable energy practices through our organisation, transforming our use of energy so our Australian campuses will have net zero carbon emissions by 2030 is an ambitious project, and it is one where we are putting our theory and research and understanding into practice. Before I welcome our guest speaker, I'd also like to take this opportunity to share with you some wonderful news. I'm delighted to announce today that Professor Sachs has been appointed Sir Lewis Matheson Distinguished Visiting Professor at Monash, and I trust that you'll join me in congratulating Professor Sachs on this well-deserved position. Please welcome Professor Sachs. I'm sure it will be an invigorating and enlightening address.
President Gardner, thank you so much for all of your wonderful remarks, and especially for your leadership of a great university. And I can only tell you how honored I am and thrilled I am to be visiting professor at Monash University. I have one complaint, though, which is that I was supposed to be on the campus of Monash University this morning, today. This was the plan several months ago. And we were going to have a wonderful time of many days, not only at Monash, but throughout Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands with Professor Thwaites. And I just want to guarantee that we're going to go ahead with that as soon as possible, because I can't wait to get back. My wife, Sonia, cannot wait to get back. We love Monash, and we really admire all that you're doing. We were taken on a tour of the campus when we were there to see all of the very path-breaking projects of getting to zero by 2030. I just want everyone to know that's listening that that's not just a simple decision or a flip of a switch. That requires great engineering, great understanding of how the energy systems of the region work, how Monash's campus fits into that, and a lot of very, very clever problem solving. So it's not only a commitment of a moral and ethical kind, it's really just great engineering. And it's what we expect from Monash. Monash is leading in many, many ways. I really admire tremendously the Monash Sustainable Development Institute. I'm thrilled that John Thwaites has helped to bring me into that family. Also, Climate Works Australia is phenomenal and making many path-breaking advances. And I also want to give special thanks to Harold Mitchell, who is a great supporter of Monash University and just a wonderful, wonderful human being and a wonderful visionary, and is a tremendous support for this global effort that John and I are engaged in, and that Monash is so wonderfully hosting for the region, the UN's Sustainable Development Solutions Network. Well, this is a complicated time, this is for sure. And I think it is right to say, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that we will look back on these weeks and months as a hinge point in history. So much is at stake right now. not only the drama day to day of saving lives and doing what we can to end the massive disruptions to many lives, the massive loss of life, and all of the rest of the burdens of this pandemic. But the world is absolutely changing dramatically right now. It was before the outbreak of COVID-19, but I think it's fair to say that COVID-19 is accelerating, disrupting, and disequalizing in very profound ways global systems. And I'll spend just a few minutes of thoughts about that and some thoughts about what I hope and actually believe will happen, but with a lot of uncertainty, and then look forward to the discussion. I've felt for many years that we are at a rather deep change of the functioning of the international system. These come around every couple of generations. Certainly, World War I was one of those hinge points of history. The aftermath of World War I, basically 100 years ago now, the Versailles Treaty failed to address the deep forces at play at that time. And as a result of that failure, led to the economic calamities of the Great Depression and put the, unfortunately, the fuse burning again for a second massive and devastating war. 1945 was another hinge point in history. The end of World War II, drawing actually on the lessons from the failed end of World War I, was much better managed. Franklin Roosevelt was our greatest president in US history, and he envisioned a United Nations and a rule-based system to make work what had failed with the League of Nations. And that time, the US in 1945 enthusiastically decided in favor of multilateralism in a way that it did not in 1919, when the US Senate refused to join the League of Nations. Well, 1945 built a global multilateral structure, of course, together with a nearly devastating nuclear arms race between two superpower blocs, the US-led bloc and the Soviet bloc. 1991 was another hinge point, of course, with the end of the Soviet Union, which was really a triumph of Mikhail Gorbachev's vision of peace more than anything else, saying that it was time to reunite the world peacefully. It was a miracle. Unfortunately, the United States did not understand the miracle. It understood what it thought was a victory for a unipolar power rather than a miracle of generosity and vision for peace. And so the period after 1991 was actually very badly managed. We've had 30 years of US-led wars throughout the Middle East, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, very destabilizing and creating tremendous problems everywhere. Now we are at another hinge point, and three forces are at play that make it really very decisive and a very disruptive moment. And I mean that beyond COVID itself. The first of these changes is fundamentally geopolitical, which is that the US-led world has come to an end. The idea that the US was the sole superpower at the end of 1991 was an illusion to begin with, an illusion of arrogance of the US. But it's quite clear that we are in a multipolar world, not a unipolar world. And the rise of China, in my view, is a very positive force for the world, and one that is a deep force. This is something the U.S. Under Trump does not accept psychologically. And so, as I'll say in a few minutes, the threats to the peaceful accommodation of a new major power in the world is never easy, but it's been extremely difficult in the last few years under the Trump administration. The second fundamental hinge point of our time is the ecological crisis. We have known about it for decades. In fact, we made the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992. It could have been the occasion back to Gorbachev and the end of the Cold War for addressing the ecological crisis. But again, just as the US could not understand the meaning of peace, it could not understand the meaning of ecological crisis, because we are a petrostate like you are a coal state. And we're in the same political situation that it is not easy under our politics in either country to overcome the resistance of very powerful corporate interests. And the United States never agreed to implement the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And of course, Australia has been a very big laggard as well, because of the same politics that we face in the United States. Well, the fact of the matter is we're at the end of the chance for climate safety. Either in these next months and years, we make a decisive change to decarbonize the energy system, or we lose any hope whatsoever of staying below 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming. And with that, we lose the chance to stay below very, very dangerous levels of temperature rise that could lead to devastating feedbacks. Australia is already experiencing them. We're experiencing them. The massive forest fires, the droughts, the floods, the heat waves. All of this means that we're at the end of the tether ecologically. And the third fundamental transformation that is underway and making all of this exceedingly complicated is the digital revolution. We're in the midst of what I regard in general as potentially a massively positive range of technological changes, all linked back to Moore's Law and the billions-fold increased capacity to store, transmit, compute data. We're in the world of big data, of instantaneous data, of artificial intelligence, of increasingly smart robotics. We learned from the lockdown that a very significant part of the economy can work from home without missing a beat. I would say in my own work, other than the pleasure of face-to-face meetings, nothing has changed except more meetings, more global exchanges, morning till night, which used to be punctuated by trips to the airport and no longer are. And so I'm trying to remember which country I started in this morning, but it's been around the world during the day with meetings. And I find that a deep sign of how pervasive these new digital technologies will be and how they are reshaping the world economy. Well, all of this means that even aside from COVID-19, we were in a situation of tremendous flux. It may have been disguised in part because of our short-term politics. we have in the United States certainly the most reactionary government in our history, in the literal sense of reaction. Trump himself is a white supremacist who is not only trying to protect the prerogatives of a part of the population that is roughly, is basically only around half of the demographics of the United States now, and will become a minority part of our majority minority by the 2040s. But he's also trying to preserve the 20th century fossil fuel industry, the wealth structure, the social structure, the dominance of the white evangelical Protestant community in the United States, many things of a small part of the population trying to hold on to power in the face of massive technological, ecological, and demographic change. So that has been, aside from the fact that he himself is mentally unstable, in my view, he's also reactionary. And that has meant that it looks like there's some continuity with the past, despite these very deep trends that are changing the direction of the world in a deep way. I should add, by the way, that the other thing he's trying to do is wish away China. Literally, he's trying to say that we'll just get a coalition of countries, we'll surround China, we'll contain China, we'll get Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea, India, Russia, we'll all surround China and make it go away. Well, this is fantasy, but it is also part of the immediate politics. Then comes COVID, this terrible scourge that, as we all know now, and we've been reminded of endlessly, was warned many, many times after SARS that coronavirus epidemics would recur, that they were dangerous, that the ecological interface of humans and bats in Southwest China was sure to lead to new zoonotic transmissions, whether a repeat of SARS or some other SARS-like disease. Of course, most of our governments did not listen. I think it's important, Australia has done quite well relatively, even though Victoria is now in a lockdown right now. Your rates of infection and death rates are a tiny fraction of what we have in the United States. In fact, I took the numbers that in Australia, it's 14 deaths per million, and in the United States, 508 deaths per million. We've had a devastating pandemic because we have no coherence whatsoever in our federal politics and in half of our states. So it's been a deeply troubling phenomenon. But the point is that even before the COVID disruption, we were unhinged. Now with COVID, all of those forces that I mentioned have actually accelerated, and nothing has been reversed by COVID. So on the one side, China has handled this pandemic in the control phase after the initial outbreak in Wuhan very successfully and brought the cases down almost to zero. Quite a remarkable achievement. This means that China's already recovering while the US is completely in confusion and without any prospect of sustained economic recovery for the moment. And that means that the shift of economic weight and power continuing towards the Asia Pacific region, I think, is accelerated by this. In fact, the odd part of this whole pandemic is it's not only the United States, which has failed miserably, but much of Western Europe as well. And so the Asia Pacific has vastly outperformed the rest. China, in particular, has vastly outperformed the US and Europe. China's already with a recovering economy. And this means that on geopolitical grounds, in my view, that aspect of change is intensified. Of course, the digital economy has gained in 6 months what otherwise would have taken 10 years. Every business has been transformed in the last 6 months. Universities learned almost overnight how to go online, either exclusively or nearly exclusively. Telemedicine, working from home, the end of the office. It's been an extraordinary transformation. And I think it has shown how powerful these technologies are. And of course, at the factory level, the robotics have accelerated because the robots are not getting sick. They are not needing to stay home. The warehousing through robotics, assembly line operations have all accelerated the automation process in recent months. So that part of the transformation has also accelerated. And I would say on the third part as well, the decarbonization has also dramatically accelerated. Of course, there is the attempt in our reactionary politics to deny this. Still to this day. The US Environmental Protection Agency just dropped restrictions on methane leakage in natural gas pipelines, which is an absurd policy response to a major source of pollution. It is the desperate attempt of Trump's crony capitalism to keep alive an industry which is basically going out of business. What we've learned from the last 6 months is that there is a massive glut of fossil fuels. The price of oil has collapsed, not only because Saudi Arabia made clear that they have more than enough to supply the whole world through the whole period of decarbonization, but also because the remarkable decline of travel is not likely to be reversed in a fundamental way. Commuting is going to decline. Business travel is going to decline significantly. And the major fracking companies in the United States are going out of business. The big oil companies are shrinking to a small shadow of their former size. So my sense is that the pandemic has accelerated all three of the fundamental transformations that were already underway. And on the whole, that means that this is also the right path of recovery. Of course, there is no recovery without suppressing the virus itself. And while I won't talk at length about that, because I think we all know the story, it is likely that we're going to be in a containment mode for years to come, even with vaccines, even with reduction of case rates. This virus is going to continue to circulate. It's going to continue to transmit. We won't be in a full lockdown mode, that's almost for sure, but we also won't be in any kind of return to the past, both in our travel, in our return to offices, which won't happen anyway because people don't like commutes, and they found out a different way to organize their activities. So we're going to be in this direction for years to come. It also means that the unemployment and the rising income inequality that was already at play before COVID and has also been dramatically aggravated by COVID because the online economy functions. The brick and mortar economy, by and large, is for lower paid people in our societies. And those people have also faced unemployment, more disease, and more stress than the professional and online part of society. So we've had an acceleration also of the inequalities. So bottom line, what's going to happen and how do we recover from this? I mentioned hinge moments where disarray led to deeper disarray, or where disarray led to solutions. Both are possible in history. There is no guarantee that we go from the corona shock to a smart, green, cooperative, peaceful recovery. Shocks like this can lead to worsening conflict and deepening strife, or they can be the opportunities for constructive action and change. I'm sorry to say it, but a tremendous amount depends on the United States in this, because the US is still the most powerful country in the world, but by no means the unipolar country. And it's also one of the least responsible countries in the world under our present government. It is unimaginable, I think, for all of us that the United States could pull out of the World Health Organization, for example, at the height of a global pandemic. But that is the measure of the irresponsibility of this reactionary government that we have in the United States. That's the bad news, that so much depends on the US. The good news is that we are odds on that Trump will be defeated in November. And I think this would be the single most heartening event for the world, to get rid of somebody who will be judged almost surely to be the worst president in American history. And I think he's already won that accolade even before the completion of a term, which is how remarkable this gentleman is. But the odds are probably about 70-30 according to today's betting polls and prognosticators, that Trump will be defeated in November. Let me stay on that path, therefore, for just the remaining 2 minutes and say a couple of sentences on the other. If Trump is defeated, and I think with the choice of Kamala Harris as vice presidential candidate, this becomes even more likely. She is a very strong choice, a very attractive politician in being experienced and with leadership, and I think very appealing from a vote point of view. Biden will have an administration which will enable us to think rationally and logically about a coherent and sustainable recovery from our current situation. First, with a new president, we'll get this epidemic under control, at least relatively, unlike the chaos of 50,000 new cases per day in the United States. I'll say it again, 50,000 new cases per day, 1,000 people dying every day. And this has been going on for weeks and weeks, and there's no end in sight because there's no policy to stop it. So first, the US would be much more likely to end the epidemic because we would finally introduce rational federal policy. Second, we would have a climate change policy for the first time that would have a chance of actual implementation. The oil industry is so weakened politically, the climate crisis so advanced, and the candidacy of Biden so committed to climate action that for the first time we could have climate action where the United States, Europe, China, and other countries not only sign a Paris Agreement, but actually begin to take strong measures at national level to implement it. I think that what this means from Australia's point of view And finally, I should add, we would end the vitriolic attacks on China, though there would not be easy relations between the US and China because there are hawks in the Democratic Party as well as the Republican Party. The irrationality of the attempt to encircle China and to actually provoke a Cold War, which is the deliberate actions of the Trump administration, would end. From Australia's point of view, to my mind, this means the following. If indeed Vice President Biden is elected, I think Australia could expect a reinvigoration of global efforts on decarbonization. And the good news is for Australia that Australia could be, with the leadership of Monash and the great scientists, as well as the great resources of the country, a powerhouse in the green economy, just as it's been a powerhouse in the fossil fuel economy. So I think from Australia's long-term perspective, not only will it be a much safer world, but economically, there's a tremendous opportunity for Australia to lead in a green recovery. But almost certainly what Australia has experienced in recent years of a reactionary US government feeding the coal interests in Australia and the, I would say, the foot dragging on climate change in Australia would quickly come to an end. Also, so too, I hope and believe would be the attempt by the United States to pit Australia against China, which is the Trump policy. Australia's government has said wisely and repeatedly in recent weeks that it is not of the interest of Australia to become an enemy of China or to gang up on China. And I think that this is extremely important and right. Australia's good relations with China, China's good relations with Europe and the United States and the rest of the Asia Pacific region, in my view, are fundamentally important for global recovery and for achieving the objectives of energy decarbonization and a restoration of economic growth. So that is all to say that there's actually, at this critical moment, one could say 2-to-1 odds of a positive way forward that could come much faster than might seem likely because of this political change in the United States. If Trump wins re-election, I have to add, and I didn't want to end on a note of pessimism because I don't think it's going to happen, but I think I will end on a note of completeness. If Trump were somehow to steal the election or win the election or try to stop the election, I think what we're going to see is basically a loss of American functional capacity. We're nearly at that stage where politics has stopped. We have rule by decree. We have tremendous instability. And thank God we have an election coming up. So I'll end there. I will turn it back over to you, John.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. And at your last oration, the Richard Larkin's oration, everyone stood up and gave you a standing applause. So we can't do that, but I'm sure everyone listening is very grateful for the insights that you've been able to give us over the last half hour or so. And I quite like those odds of 2-to-1. That's not bad. So I think we can be quite positive.
We're going to try to make them even better in the next few weeks.
And I think it is worth reflecting. As you said, Australia has done pretty well. And I think part of that has been overall a reasonably bipartisan approach, certainly by comparison with the States, to meeting the COVID challenge.
Absolutely.
there's a lot of lessons there, and it's been a pretty cooperative approach between the national government and the states as well. But you certainly highlighted the objective we have to have this clean and green and peaceful recovery at a global level. And I thought I would start just by asking our Vice-Chancellor, Margaret Gardner, given that Monash has such an international focus as a university, how do you see Monash contributing globally to this clean and green and sustainable recovery?
Oh, thank you, John. I think there are probably 3 to 4 things that are really important that Monash has been doing and will continue to do. I want to start with the existing public health threat. We're very fortunate that Monash has significant world-class research capability, not obviously in the medical and health sciences, which is important, but also in areas of the social sciences and other sciences and engineering. In particular, we have been contributing to the public health understanding, which is important to community response to the challenge through our researchers, and we're engaged at a high level in the development of developing and testing candidate vaccines, testing other drugs that will have, we hope, effective therapeutic outcomes. We've actually got a new blood test in development that's very fast. So the things that will actually assist in mitigating this global pandemic, but also assist us as a community in understanding how we manage these things, because as Professor Sachs so rightly said, we can't assume that this will go away overnight, or that this is the first global and last global pandemic we will deal with in our lifetimes. So research really important, and building the communication with the public in general and to government by offering our expertise wherever we are. And we do that on all our campuses. So our researchers in, for example, Malaysia, on our Malaysia campus, also provide advice to government. So the point about research knowing no borders is true and is available always across the world. But second, our ability to have footprints in other places gives us what you might call the human conduit to actually providing that advice quite directly to governments in a variety of places. And we have footprints, as you know, in a number of places, enables us to perhaps more effectively take that advice out. The second thing is actually the way and I've talked about that aspect of the advice. I should say Monash works on social science, for example, domestic and family violence, very important issue that it is evident across societies in general, but has been heightened in lockdowns. So there are a number of areas of research where I think that advice, development into policy, is an important part of what we do. The training of students and the being open to the world. So we are now, as Professor Sachs said, in a hinge point. It would be easy to pull back and to say that mission of being engaged with that education globally is to be decreased. No, we must actually cleave to that. We must make that work more strongly, because it is in those links through our students and our alumni that we both are able to more effectively spread understanding of research and rational ways of approaching policy and changes in community behaviour and changes economically and socially, but also building the links across countries, which are an important part of attempting to counter geopolitical uncertainty, which on top of these global pandemics is the other issue. So the research, the education and the commitment to taking that good quality research and evidence into our education and into the community through our students, through our alumni and through our researchers, by being present and engaged across the Asia Pacific that is that commitment to continue that. I think they're the important things that we need to stick to, because the push is to go the other way, to turn in, to focus on your own backyard, to shrink your contacts. As a university, we must actually push out all the time, reach out, communicate better, drive the research out in advice and engagement with the community. And I think that's what I think we can do.
Thanks very much, Vice-Chancellor. So Professor Sachs highlighted the importance of China and its increasing role. And I have a question from Harold Mitchell on this. And Harold has asked, the Australian economy and our likely economic recovery are very closely tied to China and the Asia Pacific. But the tensions that you have highlighted with China are threatening this relationship. What should Australia do to maintain its relations with China and the region as it seeks to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic? You're on mute, Jeff.
Thank you very much, and thanks to Harold for the important question. I think that within the Asia Pacific region, the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, is actually a fantastic unit that Australia could constructively use for regional cooperation, including China, but not only a bilateral issue between Australia and China, but a regional cooperative issue. I really like RCEP. It is the 10 ASEAN countries, China, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. It's 2.2 billion people. It is a major part of the world economy. And by and large, with a couple of very important partial exceptions, it's done very well in containing the pandemic. We're hoping that in Philippines and in Indonesia, that this does not run out of control. But in the rest of ASEAN, in China, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, there is a low level of transmission, even if there are the reversals that have recently occurred in Australia and in New Zealand. Indeed, everybody has continuing outbreaks. That's part of this story. But the containment has been effective. So I would recommend at a minimum, under any circumstances, to try to have a regional approach to the restoration of economic activity, to try to use the RCEP framework diplomatically, and even use it as a functional unit for reestablishing travel to a limited extent, establishing common standards for containment policies, for technical cooperation on the epidemic, but certainly to keep an active degree of engagement right now. The US is playing a game. It's partly a political cycle game because Trump's base wants the red meat of anti-China sentiment. And this has been exposed. It's very obvious that it's a game. In fact, we have manuals from the political advisory groups for the Republican Party explaining what to say about China, how to blame it for the epidemic, how to blame the Communist Party. Don't call it China, call it the Communist Party of China, and so forth. And Pompeo, our Secretary of State, gave an absolutely vulgar, if you'll excuse me, speech last week provoking a Cold War. And this Australia does not want to be pulled into by any means. And it will significantly stop, if Biden is elected, So my main advice to any government anywhere is temporize until November, because the world could look very, very different after the November elections. And I think the odds are that it will look very different. So everything that Trump is trying to push right now, including making a G11 to surround China and all of these things, better to say, thank you, very interesting. We'll talk in December. And we'll see what December is like. But hopefully December will be a quite different perspective. And if Biden is elected, as Kamala Harris, the vice presidential nominee, said, of course we continue to cooperate with China on climate change and on other important issues, we'll have a very different geopolitical situation. So I think that would be my two main points of advice. Get RCEP as a working, functional unit in any event, because it's a very good concept. And then, in addition, just take a deep breath for all of us, and hope that the polls are correct, and that we have a more responsible government coming into office in the United States. It will put so much less pressure on Australia to have a Biden presidency than a Trump presidency.
Thanks, Jeff. And of course, Monash has very close relations with many Chinese universities and has a campus in China, and we'll be growing our efforts there. Jeff, you did highlight, of course, the clean and green recovery. As someone who's previously been a advisor to UN Secretary Generals on the Sustainable Development Goals, and now you're an SDG advocate, what role do you see the Sustainable Development Goals playing? And we have a question from Peter Hunt today, who has asked, how do we get the Sustainable Development Goals more on the agenda of our national government so that Australia can improve its performance?
So the SDGs are the basic framework of decency that are, at a fundamental level, our generation's restatement of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The UN, every 10 or 15 years, has a new set of goals, which basically say, once again, that everybody should have the right to health, to education, to livelihoods, to social protection, and to safe living conditions. The SDGs added some specificity to that general set of propositions by focusing also on the ecological crisis in a far more systematic way. SDG 12 is stopping pollution. SDG 13 is on climate change. SDG 14 is sustainable ocean environment. SDG 15 is sustainable terrestrial environment. So there's more specificity, but this is basically decency. And the decency is that our wealthy economies should also be fair, inclusive, and environmentally sustainable. If any generation, starting also back to 1948, could see how rich we are right now, they would find it unimaginable that we would tolerate extreme poverty in our midst. The United States per capita income is 4 or 5 times higher than it was in 1948. And yet we have people who are hungry in the United States because we have a mindset of nastiness among part of the political class and part of the actually social milieu, this libertarian Ayn Rand philosophy, which is leave the poor to suffer. We have in the United States, by the way, one person, Mr. Bezos, the founder of Amazon, who personally this morning has $190 billion of wealth. And Mr. Gates, 120 billion, and Mr. Zuckerberg, 100 billion. And our country's so crazy, this is viewed as normal. This is not normal. This is a perversity in a country where you have 15% unemployment in effect, and hungry people. And they don't even step forward to say what they're going to do about this. So to come back to the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs are a charter of decency. They say, are you kidding? Of course everyone needs healthcare. Of course everyone needs access to education. In Australia, there's nothing shocking about that. But in the United States, we're still fighting over this primitive idea: should people have access to healthcare? Because we have tens of millions of people that are uninsured or underinsured because our society is so nasty, actually, or the powers that be. I just looked, and I know I'm digressing, but Forbes magazine just published today a list of 30 billionaires supporting Trump for re-election with mega campaign contributions. These are people with $4 or $5 billion. What do they need tax cuts for? Why do they need $10 billion? You can actually live fine on $1 billion. You don't need more. They get by, John, with just $1 billion. But they want tax cuts, they want breaks, they want more. And so all of this is to say the SDGs are nothing more than decency. A government that doesn't embrace them, something's a little odd, because it's basically saying, oh, you don't think all children should have schooling? You don't think that everybody should have decent nutrition? How could you not think so? And this is what we have to absolutely explain in our politics and so on, and in our public communications, which is very noisy, very hard. I won't riff on the Murdoch news empire in our country, but it makes it very hard to communicate these issues. But this is basically what we need to do.
So, Jeff, I have a question here from Carol Schwartz, which focuses on a specific Sustainable Development Goal, Sustainable Development Goal 5, gender equality. Yes. And the aim is to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. But Carol Schwartz asks, the data tells us that COVID-19 has amplified the patterns of women assuming more of the unpaid work burden and also losing in the economy and in jobs. What do you see as the solution to this issue and to women's workforce participation, which we know is a huge boost to economies in the post-COVID-19 world?
I think the first thing to say, and you know it with your next door neighbor, Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, that places led by women in the world today have vastly outperformed the places led by men. Definitely Trump has some kind of testosterone problem. I don't know what it is. He has not been diagnosed, but there's something wrong in a way that no woman would have this phenomenon that we have. I think the same is true with Mr. Bolsonaro and with others. But you have Prime Minister Ardern, you have the Prime Minister of Denmark, the Prime Minister of Finland, the Prime Minister of Iceland, where the women are leading. It is systematically the case. This is not just a gloss. It is absolutely systematically the case that there's better performance. And this is because it is true that this syndrome that we're experiencing in the United States, actually, I have to say it is a men's syndrome, and it is a serious problem. So the challenge is not only the gender equality throughout the society, it is in the politics itself. And it's extremely important that we have more women leaders, because we're going to have better performance. If it was all women leaders, I think the world would be a safe place, actually. But we need more. In terms of the implications of the SDGs and how to handle things, as the question noted, And as I said, the SDGs have amplified and aggravated all these inequalities. This is absolutely the case. One could add in reports all over the world of gender violence, or violence against women, I should say, at home during the lockdown phase and so forth. So there are many, many problems that need to be addressed. But the basic concept of the Sustainable Development Goals was empowering women at all levels, in government, in business, in education, so that there's absolutely equal enrollment at all levels of schooling and universal completion of schooling for boys and girls at a minimum up through the secondary level. And one can say without question that the countries that are engaged in true gender equality policies are happier countries, higher life satisfaction, better quality of life. It is many of the countries that I mentioned, which come out at the top of the world's list for well-being, because I also edit each year a World Happiness Report based on Gallup data. And it is also objectively the case that where there's more gender equality in terms of representation in politics, in boardrooms, in labor force participation, the happiness of the society is systematically higher.
Thanks, Jeff. I've got a number of questions here that relate to class and work, and I'll try to put these together. Ron Ben David has suggested that the middle class has been the greatest moderating and enabling force in history. It's been shrinking and we're seeing the consequences. Therefore, is rebuilding the middle class and reigniting middle class aspirations a necessary first step to rebuilding the confidence needed to tackle the big challenges that you've identified? And there are comments around that question about the impact of the gig economy and digital technologies on work and the middle class. And if the new jobs are all in low-paid gig-type work, what will be the impact of that? And in this period, how do we provide people with the skills necessary to get good jobs, not just cheap gig jobs?
I think first of all, these are really tough questions for which there are not pat answers. Because whenever there is a deep technological change, there is big disruption of the income distribution. So this is not the first time that we're seeing a very significant change of income distribution provoked by underlying technological changes. I think this process has been underway for 50 years at least, because the automation, remember, was the big theme of the 1960s. This already started in the factories back in the 1960s, and the assembly lines were converted to robotics, but now this has become more and more pervasive and even accelerated. The result, by and large, has been, I'll speak about the US, really two societies. Those who have a bachelor's degree or above, a four-year university degree or above, by and large, not in every case by any means, but by and large, have had rising living standards, and with advanced degrees, very significantly rising living standards. This has been a great 30 years. Those with a high school degree, and in the US, very peculiarly with some college where people drop out because they have too much student debt, those jobs have diminished. Real earnings have declined. Jobs have disappeared. Labor force participation has weakened. Actually, suicide rates, drug use, and so forth have increased. So we divide in the US very strongly by educational attainment. And the vote is divided. Trump's vote primarily, aside from the few billionaires, is primarily white, high school, or some college level. And he loses among all the other demographics, which are people of color, minority groups, and people with university degrees or higher. And his base, by the way, is absolutely not a majority, which is why it's only very accidental. Again, I won't digress that he actually was able to win the presidency because of our peculiar system and why he's likely to lose. But this is the division of society. It will get worse under just normal market forces because we're chopping off more and more jobs. The retail sector is going to shrink tremendously because of e-commerce. The office support sector is going to disappear when people are working from home and when we restructure the work environment. Robotics and artificial intelligence systems are going to replace a lot. Eventually, maybe not eventually, maybe soon they're going to replace me. Maybe more interesting lecture, but certainly an ability to read more journals faster than I can read them, because a good artificial intelligence system could look up keywords in 20,000 journals by the time that I finish trying to review one journal. So this change will be very deep. The question is, what will it mean socially? One possibility is Mr. Bezos doesn't have $190 billion of income. He has $1 trillion of income. Of course, by then, our society will have gone completely nuts. It would only be through extreme repression that such a society could function. The alternative is that we all benefit from these technologies through redistributive policies. We don't allow one person to have $190 billion, no matter how creative they are. We have tax policies that ensure that the benefit is shared more widely in society: universal access to health, education, vacation time, family leave time, adult education opportunities. In other words, we use the advancing technologies to improve lives generally, not just depending on your market earnings, but through the provision of social goods throughout the society. And this, I think, is really the way to proceed. It is essentially the way that Norway, Sweden, and Denmark are proceeding. So if one wants to see where this process is most advanced, it would be in the Northern European social democracies, which have had a widening income inequality of pre-tax earnings, but not so much of net of tax and transfer earnings, because of the universality of public services and public goods. And in Sweden or Norway or Denmark, if you're working class or professional, you have 6 weeks vacation time paid over the summer. You have a good life. You have fewer working hours. You have guaranteed health and education all the way through university, even if you're working class. So it's not tied so much to your occupation, your quality of life. And this, I think, is what we're going to have to do. Still to keep incentives for people to generate excellence, to improve themselves, to get education, to work. I'm a believer that healthy people should work, and that benefits should not just be handed to people as universal basic income no matter what. But I am a believer that everybody should have a quality of life and dignity, no matter what their occupation is, and that we're easily rich enough to guarantee that, and that we could guarantee it without breaking the incentives for continuing improvement in one's life circumstances.
And Jeff, you highlighted there the importance of the provision of social goods. And I know we have Martin Foley in the audience, who's the Minister for Mental Health, and he has highlighted an issue here, just you might briefly comment on, is how to ensure that social recovery doesn't become the poor cousin to economic recovery in the comeback from COVID-19.
Well, great. Thank you, Minister, for asking. It is the truism of our work in the World Happiness Report, and especially spurred by my co-editor, Lord Richard Layard of London School of Economics, that the single biggest factor in lowering well-being in a society is depression and mental illness in general. And it is also one of the lowest cost ways, therefore, to raise well-being in society, because there are effective treatments, cognitive behavioral therapy, and many others that can be highly effective and help people who are in mental distress. And certainly this epidemic is raising a lot of mental distress by people who already have anxiety disorders or enough actual stress in difficult lives, or depression and so forth, coming with the isolation. So it's always been our first point in the World Happiness Report every year that we write it: attend to mental health services, period. Because this is the single most effective intervention in any society. And it's shocking. In the US, the estimate is that only around a third of people who have mental illness, like depression, are actually receiving consistently professional services. And it's a tragedy. It's a shame. Now, COVID will amplify this. And I think the other truism of the World Happiness Report that we repeat every year, but it's also based on deep data, is that social isolation is the biggest factor, other than mental illness or extreme economic deprivation. Isolation, loneliness, distrust within society, and a whole theme of our work every year is to emphasize that a high level of social trust and a high level of social connectedness is the powerful magic medicine to raise well-being significantly in society. Australia ranks quite well in overall well-being, and this is very, very important. So much better than the United States, which has been seeing its measured well-being declining year after year now for almost 20 years. So Australia understands a lot of this already, but I think that putting the emphasis on these two factors, ensuring that people who have mental illness are able to get professional services, and ensuring the social connectedness as a basic goal of society are the two main points that I would emphasize.
Jeff, unfortunately, we're now out of time. We've seen an explosion of questions towards the end, which we're not going to be able to deal with, but we will collect them and consider them and forward them on.
Okay, great.
And amongst the statements there wasn't really a question. I think it was more a statement that was Jeff Sachs for US president.
Yeah, right. I'm not sure I could get the vote within my household. Probably not the block, but in any event, thank you very much.
But and I certainly can't agree with your comment that you might in one way be replaced by artificial intelligence. I don't think you're replaceable, at least not in your lifetime. But thank you so much for your insights. Particularly thank you for agreeing just to answer questions in this very straightforward way and have what's been a really interesting discussion. Thank you to all the people that have attended today. It's been a very high attendance, a lot of interesting questions, and we look forward to continuing our relationship with you as a visiting professor to Monash. And thank you to our Vice-Chancellor, Margaret Gardner, who of course appointed you to that position and has hosted you today. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks to everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, John.